The Ralph Pointer I used to know rode around New York with a motorcycle with a gorgeous young woman who was still gorgeous on the back of the motorcycle, Lynne Stewart. Now, my old friend John Britton in the audience thinks that we know each other longer than anybody else in this room. We met in 1963, but I have to tell you, Lynn and I went to Jamaica High together in 1958. And we were the New York City Championship basketball team in 1960. So in celebration of that, we're going to sing the school song of Jamaica High. Lynn always says, don't do that, and Ralph says, I'll kill you if you do that. Here's a song to her, we love Jamaica. I can sing. That's Jamaica, New York.
Neither of them can sing, so ask them to proceed.
We'll sing it later. I want to say something about Mumia. Amnesty International said his trial was a fraud. Before the trial began, in the antechambers, Judge Sabo, Albert Sabo, said in front of a secretary, an award-winning court stenographer, yeah, and I'm going to help him fry the nigger. That was the judge that tried Mumia's case. The two cops said they heard Mumia confess, saying, yeah, I'm glad I killed the MF. One of the cops they never brought to witness, to the stand, Alphonse Giordano. He was in charge of the crime scene. He claimed that when they tried to kill Mumia, they kicked him in the head over and over on the scene. He had a bullet in his chest, and they tried to kill him right there, dropped him off the stretcher, rammed his head into a telephone pole, and threw him into a paddy wagon, whereupon Giordano, in his report, said Mumia confessed to the murder. But they never put him on the stand, because he was indicted by the Justice Department for corruption, involvement in every kind of prostitution and drugs and so on. They figured he wasn't a reputable witness. So when they try to kill again Mumia, they put the foot of the cops on the drainage bag. He was unconscious, and they try to force the fluids back up into his body to kill him. Two other cops, 90 days later, remembered that at that moment, at Jefferson Hospital, was it? That Mumia confessed and said, yeah, because they needed someone else to say he confessed. And the doctor who was assigned to Mumia, from the second he walked into the door, or was carried in, to the time he left, in his statement said the male Negro never spoke a word. And yet these two cops, supposedly by themselves, said he confessed. Every piece of evidence, the ballistics information, was fraudulent. It was written in the report, killed by a .45 bullet. Mumia didn't have a .45, he had a .38 because he'd been shot at as a taxi cab driver after he had been fired because of his controversial reporting in support against the police for their corruption, because the Justice Department arrested some couple of dozen cops for corruption, prostitution, and drugs. And the mayor, former chief of police, stated publicly, Mumia is going to pay for what he has said about the police department. So they were after him for day one. They wiped out, in a city with a huge percentage of blacks, they practically eliminated every single black from the jury, systematically. And they played training tapes for prosecutors in Philadelphia on how to exclude blacks from juries. They ruled the motions of the attorneys out of order 90 times. They refused to allow Mumia to represent himself. They never tested his hands at the murder scene, which they always do to see if he had been fired a gun. Whereas someone else miles away, they tested his hands, because someone identified him as being on the witness scene. Someone identified him as the person whose driver's license was in the car with a friend of Mumia. And they tested his hands immediately. The lawyer, court-appointed lawyer, was a cocaine addict. Mumia didn't want him. He wanted to represent himself, and they forced him to have. This lawyer never investigated 100 potential witnesses in the case. There was an eyewitness who saw two people flew the murder scene. Mumia lay almost dead, shot in the lungs. And they didn't call, when they interviewed the woman, and she said, well, why didn't you say that you saw two people flew the murder scene? She said, I didn't want to help a black man. So the idea that Mumia is, and there's tons more evidence that we have to demonstrate the truth. So we fought back 3 times against orders to execute Mumia, and he was close. And each time we won, until finally, 30 years later, when we insisted, legally speaking, that the instructions Sabo gave were absolutely in violation of the Constitution and the law, it had to go to the Supreme Court to refuse to hear the 3 previous federal court decisions that say that the jury instructions were fundamentally flawed. And they let Mumia off death row, where he's now serving a life imprisonment until we free him in Fraxburg, Pennsylvania. Mumia is the voice of the voiceless. He's written 9 books and thousands of tapes and spoken before Newport University audiences. He's our champion, not only because of who he is, but because he represents every oppressed person, every cause. He wouldn't even allow the television cameras to make a movie of him because the television station, it was ABC, was on strike, and he didn't want, even though his case would have been broadcast all over, he wouldn't cross the picket line and allow them to be interviewed. So we are serious when we say we continue the struggle. Now, before I say anything else, I have some political criticisms I'd like to make publicly against Lynne Stewart. I was in court. It was the same courthouse where the Rosenbergs were convicted and framed up, Julius and Ethel. And when she was put on the witness stand at the end of the trial, and her attorney, Mike Tiger, said to her at the very end, Lynn, if you had to do it all over again, this is Lynn facing 30 years in prison that the prosecution would like to say, wanted her to serve. Would you do it again? And Lynn, I could see, I was close as I am to you. I could see a tear coming down her. She said, I would think, I hope, I would have the courage. No, I would do it again. By doing it again, her plans to get her convicted on 4 or 5 counts of conspiracy to aid and abet terrorism, this vicious woman. Her crime was giving out a press release to Reuters on behalf of her client, the blind sheikh Omar Abdel-Rahman. And the law said, thou shalt not let your client speak if you are convicted. And he was a frame-up victim too, and Lynn had the courage to defend him when other people said, Lynn, don't get in trouble, you're defending a Muslim. She defended him because he needed a good lawyer. And when her lawyer said, this is another beauty, you can call it criticism. When her lawyer asked her on the witness stand, well, why didn't you, if you knew it was against a violation of this special administrative measure to pass out a press release, no, they give you a slap on the wrist, so you can't visit your client for 6 months if you do that, if you violate a SAM. In fact, Janet Reno, who was the Attorney General, declined to prosecute Lynn. It was only 2 years later or so that this asshole, if you forgive my language and cut it off the tape, Ashcroft, announced on the David Letterman show that they had finally caught an American terrorist, Lynne Stewart. But for 2 years, they didn't even bother to prosecute Lynn because of her violation. But in any case, they said to Lynn, in front of the jury, if you had, why didn't you appeal? If you thought the SAM was wrong, why didn't you just appeal? And she gave a brilliant response. She said, well, look, I know this guy. His name is Mumia Abu-Jamal. He was a character witness. And she stood in front of a jury of 12 that has her life in her hand. And she said, well, Mumia had a situation where the government, the cops, the prison authorities were opening his mail and giving it to the prosecution. And he filed a lawsuit against it, and it took years for him to win that lawsuit. I didn't want to wait to defend my client and to give him the rights and to give him the representation that he deserved, that I give to all my clients. I didn't want to wait years until justice was done. So I did what was necessary to represent my claim. And what was necessary included telling the jury that the case she cited was Mumia Abu-Jamal. How many of us would have said before a jury that we defend that Mumia Abu-Jamal did the right thing? A guy who was a convicted, quote, cop killer. That took a lot of courage, an awful lot of courage. It was a statement to the whole movement that she was one of us. So Lynne is a very special person. And when people said it's too late, they never grant. They only grant compassionate release if you're a day from death. But 70,000 people, 50,000 signed a petition, and thousands other called, including all over you. Everyone wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote, sometimes 2, 3, 5 times, until the government was forced to relent. And Lynne Stewart was set free on New Year's Eve last year.